Ladies and my gentlemen, welcome to another podcast. And today we actually have somebody who, in my opinion, I've listened to a lot of people talk about psychedelics, talk about molecules and quote unquote drugs, but a lot of them are bland and super linear and don't really cross reference the subject with anything else. So, the guy I have on today hosts a podcast called the Drug Cultures Podcast, which, in my opinion, you know, Skye, I'm sure you've seen your numbers go up a little bit in the last few days. I've been binging your podcast like nonstop for like maybe
Wow,
2 days
I'm
straight.
honored.
And I know that I say this a lot, but whenever I'm doing like looking into somebody or whenever I know I'm going to talk to you, I want to find out like what you believe in and why. I want to be able to figure out the whys. And I've just been listening to your podcast, and it's absolutely fascinating how you're talking about all these other countries in the world, and yet you're uniting them, and it's almost like your podcast, like every episode kind of intertwines with one another. You kind of cross reference it in other podcasts, which I find absolutely fascinating. Which kind of glides me into the first question, which would be, when did you first like get interested in these pharmacological topics, in this sea of studies, if you will?
Well, brother, I just want to say I am deeply honored by the that moving tribute you just gave to my body of work, which I am working on growing rapidly. I have 10 episodes out so far, Drug Cultures podcast. And I will say that my interest in this subject began long before I started working on the podcast. You made a point that it feels like all of the episodes tie into one another. And that has just been the revelation that I've had since I first started researching drugs, which I do in a purely amateur capacity. I didn't study this in school. I did get a degree in college, but it was a degree in environmental science, had very little to do with the work I do for drug cultures. But actually, now that I think about it, that's not entirely true. Because in environmental science, you're taught that systems interact with each other. No one storm, no one heat wave, high pressure system exists in a vacuum. The fossil record contains evidence of the animals that lived there, but also the climates that existed in the past, a continuous record of change and interconnectedness. Large igneous provinces, which is what they call just massive areas of volcanic activity on one side of the globe, shaped mass extinctions on the other side of the globe. So I started to really understand that everything was interconnected on a geological level and on a civilizational level, the way humans interact with other humans. It's always all interconnected. So my interest in drugs began because I started knowing people who did them. This was in high school. I remember the first time I was offered weed. I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't realize anybody would ever offer me drugs. But I was very curious. I was like, why do people use this stuff? Why does it, how long have people been getting high on various things? How many ways are there to modify your consciousness? Why is this a taboo subject in society? Why are people told don't do drugs? Why is something that feel good? Why is there addiction? Why can we get our lives thrown off course by something that feels good? Shouldn't that just make our lives better? Why do drugs enhance some people's lives and ruin other people's lives? Why are some drugs more ruinous than others? And then, of course, the moral dimension and the political dimension. I've always been very interested in politics. I grew up very, very liberal. Just when your parents are liberal, you inherit their values. And as I grew older, I started to realize I don't think I gave up my liberal values at all. I just think I started to realize that the Democratic Party, which I had sort of been told was good, could not be absolved of sin. There was no political movement in America that could be absolved of really heinous wrongdoings, especially when it comes to drugs. And when you look at the history of drugs in America, which I started to do as I was getting into both studying politics and studying drugs, you start to realize that drug control is the history of social control.
Oh,
It is
big time.
bipartisan. It is bipartisan. It is absolutely based on racism, xenophobia, but also keeping people in poverty, keeping a sort of class divide going, and really has to also do with neutralizing other social movements. So, we really saw the crackdown on marijuana and psychedelics. I mean, marijuana has been illegal since the 30s. It was used to crack down on the black community, those initial anti-marijuana laws, but it really started to be enforced heavily in the 1960s
Yeah.
because it was associated not just with black communities, but with the Vietnam War protesters.
Yeah,
The black communities at that time started to heroin became more popular in the black community, so that was really when there was a crackdown on heroin as well.
yeah, man. Marijuana in particular, like the legalization and the prohibition behind it, that's, when we start talking about the 1970s, which I'm sure we'll get to, you know, even though their logic is tainted with like falsehoods and like blatant misinformation, I hate that fucking word, but that's actually an appropriate use of it, and you got all these guys who are saying shit that it's like if you're super ignorant it makes sense, but in the 1930s it was just complete nonsense. You had William Randolph Hearst, which was one of the biggest players in making it illegal, and the reason he made it illegal was because bro owned like fucking forests and shit and like lumber mills, and because the decorticator was made, it made hemp production much cheaper to produce. So there were other companies making like clothes, paper, and shit. And this guy was losing fucking, I don't know what the equivalent of bankruptcy would be, but bro was fucking going bankrupt. And in the 1930s, I forget who directed it, but Reefer Madness. If you watch that movie now, it's a fucking comedy. But back in the day, they were really saying that, oh, yes, young black men and Latino men are smoking this new drug, marijuana, and they're raping white women. And it's like, what the fuck? And so you hear that now and you laugh at it, but back in the day, they took it serious. But nobody back in the 30s knew that this new drug, marijuana, was hemp. No one knew that it was cannabis. And so it was really these two fucking dudes who were the biggest players, who were, they're the ones who hired all these lobbyists back in the day. They're the ones who bribed all these scientists. It ties directly back to these two fuckheads. I could look it up, but my keyboard's very clickety clacky, so I don't know if you want to look up who the director of Reefer Madness was, but yeah, man. And so it's just crazy when you tie all that in, and what you're saying is true as well. You look at the 1970s when you had the Black Panther movement, and the fucking FBI was sticking their noses in there, man. You had fucking white people trying to get in with the Black Panthers, dude. It was fucking nuts. And the hippie movement at Woodstock when they were giving people acid and killing people and shit. There's definitely,
Yeah.
I would love to say that this is why the drugs are illegal, but the reality of the situation is like there's so many lies that people have been told for decades and decades, and and then confirmation bias kicks in, and then you hear these stories about other fucking people who kill people on drugs, and then they connect it, and most people are going to work and paying their bills. They've been
And that includes
watching.
most drug users, I will say. Most users of most drugs are law-abiding citizens. They might have a dependence or they might not, but they're the stories that you hear about people who are on drugs. I
Yeah.
am a firm believer that most of the behavior that you hear about is not because of the drugs themselves. Some of
Oh,
it,
for
sure. Some
sure.
people have bad reactions to all sorts of drugs,
Yeah.
but
That's what I was saying. That's what I was gonna get to when you said that earlier. because I wouldn't blame the drugs. You know, I heard a really good quote off of, I'm not sure if you watched it, but it's called the Midnight Gospel, and
I'm a
yeah,
fan. I'm a fan of the Midnight Gospel.
my favorite show of all time. And you know, I believe it was the first episode when Dr. Drew said everything is circumstantial. You know, every drug is circumstantial. You know, fentanyl gets diagnosed at the hospital. You know, people get diagnoses for like fentanyl patches, and that's for like extreme pain. You know, if you get burns on 90% of your body, you're gonna probably want a fucking fentanyl patch. You know what I'm saying? So
Oh,
everything is
absolutely.
everything is circumstantial. And but I think the real question is, why do we have a society full of people who think that it's okay to throw their lives away? And as long as you're on a street corner where it's sunny all the time, you can just live in a fucking tent in front of people's houses and fent fold all day. You know, why what kind of society promotes that behavior, you know? And
Now, there's
I
lots
don't
of.
know
Do
the
you mind if
solution
I?
to it. I'm
Do
just
you mind if I
presenting
jump
the.
in response to that?
Yeah, no, for sure. Go for it, buddy.
Yeah. Well, I think you have raised the central dilemma that led me to make this podcast in the first place. And I'm
Yeah.
going to rephrase what you just said, which is if somebody gets fentanyl in a hospital, that can be the life-changing pain medication that allows them to get the sleep they need, that allows them to emotionally
Eric.
survive whatever excruciating pain they're in. And then that same exact molecule, you know, if it's mixed into heroin, is what causes over 100,000 people to die of overdoses every year. You know, the
Yeah.
exact same molecule.
Yep.
And so I'm a firm believer that drugs in a vacuum are pretty much always value neutral. No matter how much pain and suffering the drug is actually responsible for in the real world. And so the point of my podcast was to take individual drugs. Sometimes it's drugs people have heard of. Like, you know, I did a Kratom episode that's a pretty widely known drug. There are something like 5 million Kratom users in America.
Yeah.
It's not as widely known as like marijuana, but. And then sometimes I take a drug that's a little less well known. Like the first one I did is a drug called khat, which is super widely known in Yemen, but almost unheard of in America. And I'm working
Yeah.
on an episode about ether right now, which used to be a really popular drug. Most people these days have never heard of ether, don't know what ether is.
Isn't
Um,
it like a form of alcohol or something? And it makes you
no, it's
hallucinate?
chemically. It does make you hallucinate, and it's chemically related. It is sort of it's a distilled spirit, but it doesn't contain alcohol in it. I don't really know how it's made, but it's closer in effect to ketamine or nitrous oxide. It's a dissociative anesthetic. Chloroform also used to be a drug of abuse that's pretty
Oh,
similar to
dude.
ether.
Oh my
Yeah.
God. Oh, could you
Um,
imagine? You know, and I'm kind of digressing by saying this because I did have a question, and I hope to God I don't forget. But you know, when I think of shit like that, like chloroform, because I've heard of that, people doing that willingly. It's like I heard of this thing where you lean up against a tree and like exhale as hard as you can, and then your buddy punches you in the stomach, and you fucking black out. I forget what it's called, but it's like, and it makes you just super dizzy, and it's because all the oxygen. It's like you're giving yourself a fucking seizure. You know? That's crazy. That's crazy shit. And it's nuts how like people will do that and purposefully like, yeah, I'm going unconscious right now, you know, and just not even think about the repercussions. But um I digress. I wanted to ask, you know, you talk a lot about these other drugs in other countries, and one of your podcasts that really stuck out was the one where you were talking about Israel and Palestine, where you were talking about like these ancient Palestinian, I forget if they're herbs or spices or whatever it is. And I find that kind of shit fascinating. Like, sure, it's one thing that we have like ayahuasca or, you know, like fucking ibogaine, all that kind of stuff. But it's like if we sent a researcher in there, like for real, you know, we could figure out what that shit is. But my question to you is, what's your take on like the Lucinian mysteries or the blue water lily? You know, have you ever heard of either one of that shit?
Y- Yes, absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
let me first start by giving your listeners some context because you brought up Israel and Palestine and then asked me an entirely different question.
My
So I
bad.
want to
My
explain a
bad.
bit. I want to explain a bit about what I did with that particular episode,
Sure.
which I highly recommend everyone listen to. Episode 7. It's called
It's pretty
Israeli
good.
Anti-Foraging Laws. And what I did was I basically took the framework of what is a drug. I asked the question, what is a drug? And I was like, can a drug be an entirely political construct that is applied to things that are actually not psychoactive? So in this case, it's
100%.
these Palestinian herbs, zatar and akub. There's some other anti-foraging laws that apply to. There's an herb called miramar that's like a sage that grows wild. And basically, what I was saying is that these are plants that have been prohibited for purely political purposes. You know, the
Yeah.
Israeli government makes environmental justifications, but really it's purely political prohibition. You can't pick these because they are important plants to your national identity, and we
Yeah.
don't believe you should have a national identity. You know, most Israelis and the Israeli government don't believe there should be a Palestinian state. And there are lots of, you know, this is not
That's
a
weird.
personal attack on Israelis. This is like, there's a lot of cultural trauma from the Holocaust and
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. That being said, it's the exact same tools of oppression that we do for our drug war. It's the
Yeah, right.
exact same tools of oppression that the Thai government uses to oppress the Malay ethnic minority in the south of the country. It's the exact same oppression that white reservation officials used on Native American reservations in the early 20th century to stop peyote use. Like,
Yeah.
drug control and drug prohibition throughout time has been a function of like what we do to civilizations. And in the Israel episode, I was like, okay, well, let's examine this Israeli policy, the set of Israeli policies, through
Yeah.
the lens of drug control, even though nobody else, to the best of my knowledge, has thought to compare Zatar and Akub prohibition to marijuana or kratom or peyote prohibition.
And I've never
Now, in answer to
fucking
you,
heard of it. My bad.
in answer to your question, um, about the Eleusinian mysteries. Well, obviously, I'm sure you're a fan of Murarescu, Brian Murarescu's book, The Immortality Key.
Yes.
Um, so Brian Murarescu is a great scholar who's both an expert on psychedelics and Greek history. He was originally a classicist, so he studies ancient civilizations. And his
Okay.
thesis was basically that there were these Eleusinian mysteries, which have been well documented, but sort of kept secret as to what they were. And the mystery religions were basically these kind of religious cults in the ancient world, but they certainly in ancient Greece, that involved taking some sort of pilgrimage that, like, not everybody got invited to take this pilgrimage. You had to already be kind of an accomplished member of society, a notable figure. And you would be invited to take these pilgrimages and have this experience where suddenly you understood that death is not so important. You understood the sort of transient, inconsequential nature of death in the biggest picture. You
Is
understand that.
that? Oh, sorry. My bad.
No, what were you going to say?
I was gonna say, is that what it was about? Because I've heard a lot of different
Ostensibly.
things.
What have you heard?
I've heard that it was more like a rite of passage. Like, and you figure kind of out like your role in the world. That was kind, and you know, you only can go there once in your life, and it's
That
very
is true. You can only do it once.
yeah, and you go there, and it's kind of like this. I would like to compare it to ayahuasca, even though we know that it was lysergic acid or some sort of lysergen. But I would like to, at least from what I know, and I'm probably wrong because I'm wrong a lot, but it seems like a lot of people went there and then kind of figured out their place in society. Maybe I'm wrong because all these, when we're looking at these countries who have these mysteries, like the fucking Aztecs, for example, even though they kind of went bad shit crazy at the end there, and killed like what was it, 80,000 people in 3 days. But when you look at their architecture, and then we have a LiDAR scanning over the Amazon rainforests, and we know that a lot of these psychoactive drugs are grown in these dense rainforests, and I can't help but think that a lot of these ancient civilizations are somehow more advanced in that way. That's kind of where I subscribe to the Graham Hancock side of
I
things.
was
I
about to
think
say a Graham Hancock fan. I see.
yes, yeah.
Um,
I love
well,
that dude.
he's great. He's great. I mean, I say that with the massive caveat that I think he goes out over his skis a lot of the time. I think he's
Sometimes.
great. He's great in terms of making you think, but I would caution anyone listening to this podcast to like take everything he says with a grain of salt.
Well, I
Let it be
mean,
poetic inspiration for your own research. It's he's not a scientist.
well, I
Um,
mean, he has more experience than a lot of scientists, especially if we're talking about the Younger Dryas impact theory. He got mocked at for years and years. And I mean, sure, he wasn't the only one. You have guys like Dr. Robert Schoch, Randall Carlson, but these guys have actually been there. And when you do the research and you hear the guys, like for example, this goober Flint Dibble, who dare tried to even debate Graham Hancock. By the way, the only guy. He got fucking ruined. His career, like, dude, bro can never go on a podcast again. Like he threw his fucking career in the garbage can because when you debate
I'm
this
gonna be
shit,
honest. Oh,
oh,
go
yeah,
on.
when you debate this shit and you're blatantly lying, because he blatantly lied several times. And I'm not an archaeologist, but I can smell when there's condescension in the room, you know. Continue what you were
And
saying though.
I listened to the entirety of that podcast, and I came away with a different interpretation. Um, and here was my interpretation of the podcast, which is that they were arguing past each other. They were not engaging in the same argument. Now, I'll keep this thing short because probably most of your listeners haven't listened to this particular episode of the Joe Rogan Experience. But
Oh, who cares? Let's talk about it. They'll listen after this. Why not?
yeah, it's a great episode. Listen to the
Yeah.
debate. So Dibble is a scientist, very accomplished archaeologist, and he was making consistently points about what we know. Here's
Yeah.
what we know happened.
Yeah.
And Hancock was consistently making points about what we don't know. 95% of the surface of the earth hasn't been explored in terms of archaeology. We have no idea what's buried in coastal shelves that were above water during the last ice age and below water now. We have no idea what's buried deep in the Amazon rainforest in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
There's huge, and for good reasons, and sometimes, archaeological digs are very environmentally damaging. you know but
But
Hancock was saying there's just so much we don't know, and I have this
yeah,
really
it's
compelling
true.
theory about the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which is that 12,000 years ago, the I think it was the Perseids. I don't remember which one. It was a meteor shower that basically caused cataclysmic climate change and left this iridium layer. And you can see the iridium layer. There certainly was
Yeah, the
a lot
nuclear
of a
blast.
lot of yeah, there was a lot of meteoric activity at that period of time.
Yeah, man.
Now, as someone who myself, I have a fair bit of geology training. I studied it in college. Um, there are a lot of other hypotheses for what caused that particular climate change,
Right.
including, but not limited to, the draining of Lake Agassiz, which was a lake in the central North America that was bigger than any of the Great Lakes. It was a massive
Really?
lake. It was a glacial lake, so it was sitting on top of a glacier that was a mile thick. And as that
Wow.
glacier began to recede, natural slow moving climate change, the glacier
Yeah.
began to recede, and glacial Lake Agassiz, and this is the prevailing scientific theory for what caused the Younger Dryas event, was that the glacial Lake Agassiz drained into um, the Hudson Bay.
Oops.
When you have a massive influx of cold water, seriously, like so much cold water, you
Yeah.
change ocean circulation patterns. That can have a massive and abrupt climate change. That's what people are afraid about of climate change now, is that because the Arctic is warming so much faster than the equatorial regions, you're going to have changes in ocean circulation that's going to have dramatic and unpredictable climate changes. So again, this goes back to my whole thing about systems
Right.
being so incredibly complicated.
Yeah, man.
So I thought that Dibble was absolutely arrogant and
Yeah. He was wrong
condescending to
about a lot of
Hancock.
things. He,
Well, he
and
was
like
wrong
I
about what we
said,
don't know. He was
it
wrong
got
about what we
proven.
don't know.
It was proven, that he was wrong. And if I wanted to, I mean, we could listen to the fucking whole thing. Honestly, I would love to with you. You might be a really interesting person to listen to a podcast with. We could do a podcast about that. Let's do a podcast about listening to a podcast. Come on, Skye. No, but
Those exist out there. Have you heard of
really?
Talk Tua, the Talk Tua podcast?
Oh God, yes.
There was a
Unfortunately,
podcast that emerged called Talk Tua, where it's
nice.
basically just a couple people who get together and like break down each episode of Talk Tua. And then
Oh
somebody
God.
launched a podcast called Talk Tua.
It's a great idea. I love it. I
I
love it,
know, I know,
Skye.
I
We
know.
could do it. We could do it. Listen. We'll talk after the show.
Of course, man.
But no, I mean, I don't remember the exact specifics, and of course, I've been preparing to talk about psychedelics. So I haven't really
Let's
been
talk about
preparing.
psychedelics.
But well, I find this conversation fascinating as well. I mean, this is an area I researched for a decent amount of time, But when we're saying that it's a theory, I think we should look at all the facts that surround the theory. Like whether or not it's true what happened. There's a lot of instances inside of the theory that are true. You look at places
Absolutely.
like Egypt and you look at the stones. You say you study geology, you look at those stones and they clearly have water erosion. Dr. Robert Schoch studied this for what, over 20 years, right? Some crazy shit like that. I'm sure I'm actually lowballing. I'm sure it's more than that, but I'd rather be under rather than over. So we'll lowball it. We got a guy who's been there over a dozen times, and a lot of these scientists and a lot of these archaeologists and a lot of these geologists who are contributing to this conversation are in fact people who have never been to these sites. And I don't want to be pretentious and say that they're be classist, but you have to admit that just looking at lidar thermal images is different than actually being there and looking at those stones with your bare eyes. There is a level of, you know, uh, what's the word? I mean, because when you're looking at it over a screen, it's very linear. But if you're looking, and I'm sure those 3D scans are very accurate. I'm not undermining science right now by any means necessary. But I just feel like if you're there in person, you could get more of like this nuanced feel. You actually have the dust blowing on you. You're actually breathing in the atmosphere of the area. You're getting it from your eyes perspective. I think there's a lot of things that go to it, and you could see the passages of time through these structures. Like how the fucking that big cat thing, that was like a black dude,
The
right? That was
Sphinx,
like an African
right?
face. And they carved it
The
into a
Sphinx.
cat. Yeah. But that was a black dude at one point. That was an African dude. But then they carved it into a sphinx. And they stole the gold cap off the top of the pyramid. So we could see the passages of time. And I think if you think back to it, because we know the ice age happened, and we know it had to end at some point, and then we have these large floods of time where places that are fucking deserts right now were like these tropical jungles for whoever knows how long. Sorry for yapping, bro. Sorry. It's just
That's
you
fine.
you know
I'm
you know how
fascinated by this stuff.
complicated this conversation is for sure, right? You know.
I know, and I'm like the one person who is a centrist on Graham Hancock. I feel like people either love him or they hate him, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I watched both seasons of Ancient Apocalypse. I loved it. I've listened to every appearance he had on Joe Rogan,
Yeah.
and I think he's sometimes full of shit. Like
Yeah.
I'm a Graham Hancock
Oh,
centrist.
dude. For
Um,
sure. For sure.
so
When he's talking
yeah,
about those I forget what they are that he claims they're like stairs or something, right? And they're underwater. Like that shit, I'm not buying. there's a few things. I will agree with you on that. There is a few things that he says that it's like, I can't list them off the top of my head, but that's one of them. It's like,
Yeah.
and he shows pictures of him diving down there, and even Joe's like, oh, gee, I don't know about that. You know, like there's obviously, this is one thing that I've been saying recently is that there's a lot of people are smart in one thing, but not many people can be smart in multiple things. And in fact, I don't think you can be smart fully in multiple things. If you immerse yourself in one thing, and so when he's talking about a whole, and obviously, I mean, about fingerprints of the gods, right?
Of course.
And he studied psychedelics and all that shit. So, hey, listen,
And I
man.
think that
But
some of the scientific hubris that you're describing of like
yeah,
not admitting what you don't know is
yeah,
absolutely something that
yep,
can be immediately applicable to the realm of psychedelics. Because think
yeah,
about it. Hippies have been talking about how life-changing psychedelics were for decades. You know, and even before then, there was a lot of really promising scientific research in the 1950s showing that like psychedelics had all this anti-addictive potential
yeah.
to the extent that even Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, originally wanted to
Yes,
include acid as part of his 12-step program.
I
You know,
agree.
the 13th step originally was an acid trip.
Yes.
And then suddenly you have this cultural association of psychedelics with degeneracy,
Ugh.
and none of the scientific institutions want to touch it anymore.
Which
You know,
is
the
fucked
federal
up.
government, state governments, and federal government made it so difficult to get funding to legally research psychedelics, and they made it such a career ruining trajectory that nobody between, I think there was a clinic in Maryland, I can't remember the name of the clinic, but it managed to keep doing psychedelic research up until the early 70s and after the passage of the Controlled Substances Act. But then it shut its doors in like 74. And between then and about 1990, when Rick Strassman did his DMT studies, there was just about a 20-year blackout in terms of any psychedelic research. Just 20 years of science down the drain.
Yeah.
We could have been making all this progress for all
Yeah.
these people, but science didn't want to touch it because of its arrogance and because of the political and cultural taboos against brave scientific researchers who wanted to study this stuff.
Why?
So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of sense now that scientists are very excited about psychedelics, and good. Scientists
Yeah.
should be. That
Yeah.
being said, I think we really need to remember that there was this period of time when it was completely anathema for scientists to study psychedelics at all.
Why do you think it became so stigmatized?
Well, I actually wrote a term paper on this in college, about like why psychedelic stigmatization happened, and it's not just because they were made illegal. And basically, the argument that I made is that there were these three models of psychedelic use, and two of them could be incorporated and folded into establishment institutions, and the third one couldn't. And so I'll go through them. The first one is the psychotomimetic model. The psychotomimetic model basically was like, okay, these substances clearly seem to induce a state of temporary insanity. Maybe they can be used to study other forms of endogenous insanity, why people just lose their minds. So in the 1940s and the 1950s, there was this belief that like mescaline, which was the research psychedelic du jour at that time, or LSD as you head into the 50s, that these substances could induce a schizophrenia-like state, a temporary schizophrenia from which to study schizophrenia. Now, this turned out to be way overly simplistic and not that accurate, but it was an important research model for several decades. The
Yeah.
second one is the psycholytic approach. And that was the sort of Bill Wilson model. It was the psychedelic therapy model that is back in vogue now. Psycholytic approaches means you take a small but functional dose of a psychedelic
Well,
If we're talking acid, that could be anywhere from like 20 micrograms to 150 micrograms. Like a dose that, you're tripping, but you're able to still form sentences and exist in this world and sort of get meaningful insights about your own life out of the
yeah,
experience.
I guess,
If you take higher doses of psychedelics, sure, you might get insights, but they're probably going to be pretty disconnected from your sober life.
of course.
Um, Now, that was also an important research model because there were these problems of alcoholism and abuse of other drugs, and there was this real need for, and there was also a mental health crisis in the 1950s, and people didn't really know how to speak about it, but rates of depression were incredibly high, and a lot of people were desperately unhappy and looking for something to change that. So these two
Yeah, man.
uses of psychedelics were sort of able to be incorporated into the medical establishment. Um,
Well,
and we're not even going to get into like the weird military applications or the mind control applications
we
that people were
can.
doing. We're going to leave that. We're
Yeah,
going to leave that aside for now,
yeah,
because what I was saying is that the third use is what I call the psychedelic use. Now, Humphrey Osmond, I believe, came up with the phrase psychedelic. It means mind manifesting.
yeah,
Uh, and the psychedelic use is the goal of that experience is to have a radically life changing shakeup of reality. And it was intentionally the way it was used in the like starting in the late 50s going into the 60s was intentionally countercultural. It was you take this substance because you should not agree with the way we structure society and with our social models. It definitionally could not be controlled by institutions. And
yeah.
so this was very threatening to every existing power structure. It couldn't be used medically. It couldn't be used in therapy. It, it was intended for individuals to break out and like do their own thing. And now, of course, this could end up being very dangerous for
Yeah.
some people. But it's not as dangerous as alcohol abuse. It's not as dangerous as any of these things that were legal.
Do you
It was
think?
made illegal because people didn't understand it and because it was having a corrosive influence on, you know, families and a generational divide, and there was really generational condescension toward young people who did it. And there was pressure. It was used in movements that were destabilizing socially, like the anti-war movement or the Black Panthers, although that they
Yeah,
didn't use they were not the black communities of the 60s were not always as into psychedelics as white communities, but still
yeah.
they were portrayed as being into it.
It's definitely more heroin back in that day.
Heroin,
Yeah.
marijuana. I mean, again, I always like to tread carefully when talking about this stuff, just because I'm not black. It's not my lived experience.
Oh well, I mean,
But
it's true. I
but
mean,
what I
there's
was what I was
videos
gonna
of like people selling heroin needles back in the '60s and stuff. Back in like what we would call the quote unquote ghettos. The hood.
yeah, and I think
Although
the
back then it
reason
was
I've heard
relatively nice. And you know what? So many people were on heroin, but no one was on the fucking street nodding out. It's a little strange.
right because
Sorry.
most of
Continue though.
most of the
Sorry.
well, I was just gonna say that yeah, different communities. Again, this goes back to why I'm so interested in doing this podcast. Different communities turn to different drugs because they are, as you said, everything is circumstantial. So the
Yeah.
black community, the American black community, if you look at statistics, as long as they have existed as a community in America since the slaves were freed, they have been much, much, much more poor because they haven't had the time and ability to build generational wealth off the backs of slaves. So when you are more poor, you're going to have a lot more instability in your community. You're going to have a lot more food insecurity, more housing
Yep.
insecurity. You're not going to want or need a drug that radically destabilizes your understanding of reality. You
Oh,
want
for
a drug
sure.
that makes you feel okay.
Yep. And
Now,
I'm not condoning or endorsing it, but I'm just recognizing the times. It's true.
same.
There's a lot of, and it's hard for us to be able to look back and recognize. But back in the fucking Jimi Hendrix days, dude, people were shooting heroin and making some of the greatest art known to mankind. It was
The Velvet
different, truly,
Underground.
truly different back then, man.
Yeah,
I don't
absolutely.
know what was in that shit, but it was magical. Not sure.
Well, honestly, look, a lot of the opioid crisis is because,
Oh yeah.
we have fentanyl. We have things that
Yep.
aren't heroin. You can
I knew what you were
absolutely
gonna
die
say.
of a heroin overdose, but you kind of have to be trying. If it's pure
Mhm.
heroin, it's really hard to accidentally die of an overdose on pure heroin.
Oh, for sure.
You can easily accidentally die, taking what you think is just your normal amount of heroin if it even has a tiny amount of fentanyl mixed in.
You
But
know,
fentanyl didn't
yeah,
make it onto the market until like 10 years ago.
yeah, man. And this is one of my weirdest takes, and I would like to hear your opinion on this. But um, you got guys like Dr. Chris Ryan, who says he's done heroin and it's not that bad. He went to Vietnam and he didn't serve, he was visiting on travels, and he ended up doing heroin, and he described it like, I believe, getting like wrapped in a warm blanket. You know, and that kind of guides me into my next question. What's your take? So in my opinion, when I think of prohibition, I think it only makes shit worse. I can't, even when we're dating back to the 1920s, 1910s during the alcohol prohibition, that shit just made Al Capone millions of dollars, and it enhanced these criminal organizations. Uh, Even, I mean, you could compare them to the cartel today. I mean, they were bribing the police, killing people openly in cold blood, and all while the government is just trying to quote unquote protect us, and in reality it's not working. You got speakeasies that come out, people are still drinking. In fact, if you look at alcohol production, you got guys like Buffalo Trace who are still running. You can look at the stats for how much alcohol was sold within the years of prohibition, whether it be illegally or not, and it's actually higher than before the prohibition. And so when you set these regulations and when you make these laws, oftentimes these people that are passing these laws don't even think, "Oh yeah, we're going to strengthen the cartel by hundreds of billions of dollars." And like, "Hey, let's open the border so then it's easier for these people to smuggle drugs. And then we get more make our pockets fatter, and enhance our net worth by couple million, and this is a real phenomena that is going on today. And we have this system, and you got guys like Barry Seals, got guys like Michael Rupert, who are saying, yeah, we are actually sending drugs over the border and we're flying it, and it's the CIA, and we're getting like orders from the top dogs telling us to bring these entire cargo planes full of cash, and then we're going to carry 2 tons of coke in this shitty fucking biplane, you know and they're not the only ones, and they're not alone. And do you know the story of oh shit, what's his name? I just said his name. Do you shit. Michael Rupert and oh man, I'm having a brain fart here. I am so sorry, dude. Do you remember the other
No
guy's
worries
name
at
by
all.
chance?
I do not remember the other guy that you just
Shit, it
said. I mean,
was
you started by talking about Chris James. I don't think that's who you're talking about, though.
Chris James. I
No,
know.
well, do you mind if I just
Christopher
jump in?
Roberts, I believe, is who you're referring to. Dr. Christopher Roberts. Ultimately, what I'm saying is there's a lot of layers to this shit, to why it's illegal. And one of the reasons, in my opinion, that I think it's illegal is for a couple reasons, man. Is these pharmacological companies, pharmaceutical rather, not pharmacological, pharmaceutical companies that would rather you be on antidepressant meds and anti-anxiety medication than you figure out why you're depressed and why you're anxious. And I think that it's a multi-billion-dollar organization behind that. And like you said, and I think what you said is true. It's like an onion. There's layers, like Shrek. Fucking, and it is the government. Because when you take acid, have you ever taken acid?
Yeah, sure, a couple times.
You know, I'm sure, and I don't want to speak for you, but in my experience and in the experience of others, you know, there's always that thought that hits you like, how the fuck is this illegal? Like, why is this feeling illegal? Why is there pleasure police telling me what I can and cannot experience if I'm not hurting people? You know?
I have absolutely had that thought. I think that's
Yeah.
like a universal.
Yeah.
I think there's a reason a lot of people take psychedelics and become more libertarian. Um,
It's hard not to, man.
I mean, what I want to say, I have a few directions that I can take because you've given me a lot to work with here. If you want me to free associate on what you just said.
I mean, yeah, oftentimes when I'm just kind of bringing up examples, like ultimately what I'm saying here is that there's a lot of layers to it, and it's kind of hard to understand exactly and pinpoint exactly. Like, we can't necessarily blame the drug war on racism because that's not entirely true. Although it was a part of it, a large part of it was, hey, listen, these bad guys, they're making like billions of dollars, and we're only making like 30 grand a year. These are the DEA dudes, and they're like, well, listen, maybe we could just go half on it, 250,000 for you, 250,000 for you. And you got guys like Michael Rupert who were like, okay, let's fucking do it. And I'm sure you know who Freeway Rick Ross is.
Of course.
These guys would they would fly it from Nicaragua. They would drop the fucking the package in like Arkansas or some shit. And then they would sell it to black dudes in the hood who would sell it to the whole fucking neighborhood and be like, yo, get this, man. This is the strongest shit available at the fucking moment. And because like you said, and especially if we're talking back in the 1950s, my grandfather is black. And so I was just talking to him the other day about this shit, and I was like, and obviously looking back in retrospect, this is a stupid ass thing to say, but I actually felt it in my gut. I was like, how the fuck, like, like hypothetically, dude, Mr. Skye, if you looked at me and you were like, get to the back of the fucking bus. Like, I gotta throw hands with you, dude. Like, we're fucking fighting right then and there. Like, dude, I would have been killed. I don't know how anyone was like, yo, this is cool. You got these stories about like the slave. What was it was like a slave camp where they killed every like white person in there and like overcame the camp. And then
Oh yeah, the Nat Turner Rebellion. You're probably thinking of
I'm,
the slave revolts of the
you probably
1850s
know.
and the
Yeah.
yeah, of
I
course.
don't remember exactly what the name was, but I'm sure you're right. And it's just like I think back to it and it's like, how the fuck did anyone take that shit, dude? But I'm sure that's a stupid ass question because it's like the police are racist too. But never mind. I digress. And so, you can't say it didn't exist, is all I'm saying is you can't say it didn't exist, all this racist bullshit. But I'm just repeating myself. I'm sorry, man. But
You're fine. You're fine.
but shit,
Well,
man.
let me get in and because I have a few things I've been wanting to say. Because
Yeah, my bad, dude. I'm
no, you're
yapping.
fine.
I'm yapping.
You're allowed to yap. It's your podcast. It's your show. But
Hey,
the first
man.
thing I wanted to say was that you were talking about heroin and that guy who was saying heroin is actually not that bad. And one of
Yeah.
the more interesting books I read was Dr. Carl Hart's books, Drug Use for Grown-Ups. Dr. Carl Hart, I believe, runs the God, is it? It's either the psychology or the neuroscience department at Columbia. He's he's a neuroscientist. He's a brain scientist, and he studies particularly like drug use and addiction, and works with all sorts of animal models. And he made a lot of waves by saying, "Yeah, I use drugs. I use cocaine. I use heroin, and sometimes I use methamphetamine. And I'm a very high functioning user of all these substances. I'm not an addict. I like the way they make me feel." And I'm a high-ranking professor at one of the most prestigious universities in the world,
Yo.
and that ruffled a lot of feathers, for
Yeah.
obvious reasons. Now, I want to say I'm certainly not encouraging anybody to do all of these drugs, and I actually disagree with the way in which he presents his case a lot of the time. But one of the things he talks about is this idea of psychedelic exceptionalism, which is the idea that the psychedelics are this profoundly different class of drugs that, they should be legalized. They should be made legal. They were like stupidly suppressed because people didn't want other people expanding their consciousness and realizing that, basically realizing that social constructs are incorrect. So a lot of people say, "Oh, these substances should be illegal," but like not heroin,
Yeah.
not cocaine, not meth. Those are the bad
Uh,
drugs. Those are hard drugs.
yeah.
And he basically says, "No, your psilocybin is no different than my methamphetamine. They
Dude.
have different effects. They have different effects on the brain, but in terms of how they should be regulated, in terms of the government taking a hands-off approach, it's just they're all tools to modify our consciousness so that we can live a better life in
Yeah.
this world." And that really struck me, that idea of psychedelic exceptionalism, because I think that psychedelics do have really unique benefits that, you know, methamphetamine just has a different risk profile. That
Yeah.
being said, I have known many, 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 many people who have gotten a great deal of benefit from taking a stimulant, an amphetamine type stimulant like
Yeah.
Adderall or Ritalin for their ADHD, or even I knew someone who you did it for narcolepsy. And they get great benefit out of that substance. And I have also known people who kind of went off the deep end with psychedelics.
Yup.
So at the end of the day, the way I look at the situation is there should be some regulation on the distribution side, in terms of people
Uh,
should not be allowed to sell adulterated products. People should not be
yup.
allowed to be able to misrepresent what they're selling. And, generally speaking, people should be encouraged to sell the safer version of a certain class of medicine. Methamphetamine does have smoked methamphetamine has certain risk potentials that like Adderall in a pill does not. So
Yeah.
people should be encouraged to sell the safer version of whatever class of medication we're talking about. That being said, it is none of anybody's damn business what I put in my body.
There you go. There you go. See, and this is, you know, I see your perspective 100%. I understand where you're coming from, but I think you're giving the government, which for the last 5 fucking years has been telling us, yeah, wear a mask. It works. Get vaccinated. It's good for you. Your grandma will be alive. And all of it was fucking bullshit. And if you told the truth about where the virus came from, well, guess what? We just delete you. We just mute you. You're gone now. We're gonna, if we can't see you, then you don't exist. And that's really how it was for a while. And so I think you're giving too much power to people who are fucking absolute liars. And when you say whether or not, what defines worthy, whether or not you should be allowed to do this. What are the lead ups to this? We know they can already see our fucking Google searches. Okay. We know the NSA
Hold
exists.
on.
We
Let me
know
let
they
me
can see
interject here. What do you mean by worthy? My position is that nobody should
worthy
be able to tell me
meaning
what I can put in my
meaning
body.
worthy meaning whether or not you should be allowed to get that prescription. Whether or not we have a file on you that says, yeah, this person is prone to looking up things that the government at the moment isn't too fond of. We don't approve of what they're looking up. We don't approve of the information they're seeing, and this is hypothetical, man. And based on your information on politics and what I've heard from you, I know that you know that it could get this bad. Whether or not you're on the left or the right, dude, we all know that it could get this bad to the point where, okay, wait a minute. How old are you? Okay. And it
I'm
doesn't
24.
even, no, no,
Oh,
not
you
you,
were
not.
not. I see. I was like, where you
let's
going with
say
this?
let's say hypothetically you're in the hospital and you're like, okay, how old are you? And it doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter if you could, rent out a fucking floor of the hospital that's all empty. It doesn't matter. how old are you? You know, and they dictate whether or not you get the cancer therapy. And this is shit that's actually happened over in the UK, where the government won't even let people leave to get surgery, you know? And so ultimately, what I'm saying is, sure, I understand the perspective, but I think at the end of the day, it's more important for people to be informed. I think if you're an informed person and you have the facts, you should be allowed to do whatever the fuck you want. You know, that is the key and the premise of my politics. You know, I'm totally centered, meaning if you are not directly hurting somebody or trying to take somebody's human rights, human or constitutional rights away, you know, you should be allowed to do whatever the fuck you want. You know,
Brother, we are in exact agreement on that.
one of the
I hope
best
you
ways.
don't think that I don't think that.
No, 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 no. I'm just, there are people that think that, and it's crazy, you know.
I
And
know.
one of the best ways I heard it described was, isn't it weird how we have like laws that tell you that you can't kill people? Okay, you're not allowed to kill people, you're not allowed to rob people, you can't hurt people in any kind, unless it's in self-defense. Um, where was I going with this? Oh, geez. Hold on one second, buddy. Sorry about this. My bad. I have been hitting the pendulum while we've been talking. But you know,
Happens to the
I
best of
remember.
us.
I got it. And we have these laws that tell you can't hurt people, right? But then we have these other laws that say, okay, we have to stop you from committing those laws. Like we already have the laws in place, but now we have to put more laws in place just in case you don't break those laws. Because people don't always break those laws while they're breaking these laws, but we have to put these laws so you don't break those laws. And it's this whole paradox, you know, and it's the weirdest fucking thing in the world. You know, you're ultimately stopping me from, what is it? Expanding my consciousness, you know, and I'll let you talk now, man. What's your take on that?
Yeah. Well, again, I'm a committed anti-prohibitionist.
Yeah.
I
Thanks.
think you and I have some differences in opinion in terms of our level of trust in the government.
Yeah.
I you know, I certainly
We
think that
all.
the government had we have disagreements on COVID. I think the government definitely was dishonest, or prioritized what it saw as public health over being completely honest about the science. That
Well,
being
they
said,
lied.
I see the vaccine as the lesser evil compared to COVID. That's my perspective. I see it as the lesser evil, even though clearly it's not entirely safe and effective.
You know,
Um,
it's
I knew people who died brutal deaths from COVID. Like
oh,
it's
dude.
not a not to be truffled with.
Yeah, no, I'm not
Um,
shitting. I'm not shitting on the disease itself. You know, I'm just.
I'm shitting
It's
on the disease itself.
they
Fuck
were.
that.
No, I mean, okay, fuck COVID, but I'm saying I'm not shitting on the actual people. You know, and
No, of
personally,
course.
I will just say this for myself. You know, when I got COVID, it hit me like a fucking train, dude. You know, all these
Yeah.
goobers. You know, I wish I got the flu version of COVID. The first version, the variants didn't fuck me up. The first version, and I've been saying this for a pretty long time, you know, my whole body, from my head to my feet, was fucking aching. I had to leave work. And if to anyone who knows me personally, I don't fucking leave work early. I will throw up in the bathroom and I'll hit my dab pen in my vape. I'll be good. I'll grind the rest of the day out. Fuck it. So for me to leave early, that's crazy. And then I swear to God, dude, I was like bedridden for like a week. So I'm not downplaying it. And I have more of a nuanced view of the vaccine. I think for like when you say 6 month year olds should get vaccinated, I think you're full of shit. But I think that old people and fat people with like a shit ton of comorbidities, that if you do that, even if they get the flu, die, okay, get vaccinated. But if you're telling me that my 6 month year old needs to, but that's neither here nor there. The big problem with it is when they were talking shit about Joe, you know, and when they were talking shit about ivermectin, you know, they did lie about that. That's confirmed. You know, you I mean, and to anyone out there, Go listen to I the BP the PBD podcast or something. I forget what his name is. It's some Indian dude.
Patrick, that David.
Yeah, that guy. And
Yeah, he's Iranian.
on that show they have Dave Smith versus Chris Cuomo. And I have never in my life heard someone just get so awkward in a podcast. And it's like awkward because, for people like me and you, if we get presented like the correct information, if you have the stats in front of you, undeniable, you have to conform that information. And so this was pretty much, do you know who Chris Cuomo is?
Yeah, of course.
This was pretty much this guy's last chance at like any sort of redemption in the public eye. Like this was it. And I mean, it was just so brutal to hear him not answer questions. Like just admit that you lied. You have this, and keep in mind, this was Trump who did this, right? Like, let's not fucking say this was the left or right thing here. Trump is the one who enacted Operation Warp Speed. And in order to activate Operation Warp Speed for the COVID vaccine, there couldn't be any sort of remedies that you could do on your own. There couldn't be anything that could make the experience better in order to make it like an emergency pandemic lockdown the country, And that was Trump, folks. So listen. But it's just crazy to me how that you still have people after that who will say, you know what? The government knows what's best. Dude, they fucking hate you, bro. They hate you genuinely. And I wish to God that I could be presented with a single argument against it, but I'm at a point where it's like, man, we really need to start meditating or something. Like there needs to be like this large meditation that we do as a country where we join a Zoom call and all meditate, because there's just something so out of place in the world. I don't know if you share that sentiment, but it seems like
Sort
there's
of.
like a mass hypnosis, cultish shit that's festering, dude, and it is freaky. I've had some. Listen, I don't want to be over dramatic, and I'm definitely saying this just to put it in perspective, but I've definitely had some nights where I'm thinking about shit, and it's a little hard to fall asleep, for sure. For sure. It's a little hard to rest when your mind's racing with like, oh, if this person gets elected, there's a chance that like the internet and the power goes out tomorrow, like hypothetically, speaking. And so there was some nights where it was hard, but dude, at the end of the day, man, that's really all it takes. And it's crazy now that we live in a society where politics matters that much. Like, why the fuck can't these goobers just pass like laws to lower taxes like they used to? Why is everything life or death now, it seems?
Yeah. Well, I gotta log off soon,
Oh,
but
you're all good, man.
that
No.
leads me into one more point that I wanted to make. That is sort
Yeah,
of,
for sure.
I both agree and disagree with you, and I'm going to explain why.
Yeah,
I do believe we need, as a society, a collective value change.
for
And for
sure.
me, I believe that that looks like the biggest sort of thing that you can do as an individual that is revolutionary against the powers that be right now is to log the fuck off and talk to your neighbors.
There you go.
Is to engage in the physical world with the people in your life.
Yes.
Now, that can absolutely, if you do that and then you as a group with some friends take psychedelics, that can be a beautiful and a transformative thing. But the
Yeah.
most potent aspect of that isn't the psychedelics. It's the talking to your neighbors, getting a sense of what they're going through, what their lives are all about, the factors that are hurting them. Because we live in this weird internet echo chamber right now. And I
Yes.
did an episode. Did you
I've
you probably
listened to all
listened to
your
my
shit.
episode about Well,
Which
yeah,
one?
I did an episode called Donald Trump, the first psychedelic president.
Yeah.
And basically, the point that I made is that psychedelics used to be coded as a liberal activity, as like a left
Yeah.
wing thing. You take psychedelics, you realize everything is love, you realize war is bad, you drop out of society, go live on a commune, get into reading Marx or whatever. That used to be how people saw psychedelics. And now that has all changed. And it's changed for a few reasons. Veterans have gotten really into it in terms of healing their um, traumatic brain injuries or PTSD. A lot of
Yeah.
people who are sort of just anti-government, anti-authoritarian have gotten into psychedelics as a path for like personal growth. People like Joe Rogan, who's sort of center right, and like Jordan Peterson, who's a little bit more far right, have gotten
Yeah.
really into speaking about psychedelics. And the cautionary tale I want to say is that because psychedelics have become so depoliticized, there's this real, that in itself is a political value. That is a political value that is being associated with psychedelics of like politics is stupid, it's all love,
Yes.
whatever. And I want to caution people. I want to say if you aren't careful, if you don't integrate your psychedelic experience, you can end up believing that you have encountered a true reality, an authentic expression of reality in the psychedelic world, and that is all the political work you need to do. And what I'm going to say is, no, you need to think about after your psychedelic trip, take those revelations you've had about everything being all love, about all of us being made of the same stuff, about there
Yeah,
not
man.
about death not being too significant of a thing. Take all of those
Yeah.
revelations you've had and use them to shape what you actually believe about the world. How do you interact with the people around you? How do you fight for people who are less fortunate than yourself? Because at the end of the day, they're made of the same stuff as what you're made of.
Yeah,
And so I
man.
think that's very important. And it's something I want to say is that I believe people of all walks of life can get benefit from a psychedelic. That being
Yeah.
said, and that includes all different political valences. That being said, you have to think about what you believe, and you cannot get siloed into just living in your own corner and not interacting with anyone else. You
Yeah.
got to talk to the people around you.
Got to.
And
And see,
that's the sort of what I want to leave your listeners with.
oh, for sure, man. The only way to correct wrong speech is with right speech. It's the only way, you know. And let's leave it off at that, man. Let's leave it
I
off.
agree.
I thank you so
Beautiful
much for
sentiment.
thank you for coming on, man. This was an awesome conversation, and I really hope you
Thank
come back
you.
soon because I would love to have a part two to this shit. Quite frankly.
I can't wait to listen to it when it goes live.
Awesome, man. And ladies, and my gentlemen, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day. I love each and every one of you so much. And I hope you have an amazing rest of your day. Bye bye.